Before we start our sermon, I would like to provide this little imagery. Transport us back to 1450 BC. So imagine desert. During this time, the Israelites already exited Egypt. They're already wandering around desert looking for their land of milk and honey. They have received the tablets. They have received the detailed instructions on how to build the tabernacle. We see how it's being built. We see all the materials that are being gathered. We see the specific instructions for the size, for the materials, locations, and all of these rules that have to be adhered to. They had to collect all these precious metals around, build this beautiful structure, which was portable, so you can transport it to different places. There was the outer courtyard with the altar of burnt offerings. So the general place were the place where all the lamb and all the animals were sacrificed. Then inside the actual tabernacle, there was the first room, which is called the holy place, which had the altar of incense. And of course, there was the third room, the holiest of holies, which had the actual tablets inside of the Ark of the Covenant. All the proceedings around the tabernacle were very ritualistic, had many restrictions. One of those rituals is that twice a day, the priest had to light the incense, morning and night, in front of the the altar, and he had to burn this incense. This incense was traditionally burnt either on the altar or using a censer. And this was a ritual that pleased God so much that he told the priest to do this for all future generations. In the modern day, it may be foreign to us to see a priest holding a censer, waving it around, spreading incense. But what I'm hoping is that with this sermon and the passages we're going to see today, is we're going to see how the Bible connects incense and prayer, and how we can learn how to pray. Let's read the two passages we have. One is from Revelations 5:8. The other one we already read this morning from Psalm 141, verse 2. Revelations. And when he had taken the scroll, the 4 living creatures and 24 elders fell down before the Lamb, each holding a harp and golden bowls full of incense, which are the prayers of the saints. Psalm 141, verse 2. Let my prayer be counted as incense before you, and the lifting up of my hands as the evening sacrifice. Revelations, being the complex book that it is, we already know, requires a little bit more context for this chapter introduction. And chapter 5 begins with an angel asking the question, who is worthy to break the scroll with the 7 seals? He can't find anyone, not in heaven, not on earth, not under the earth. But then we see this imagery of the one who is able to, the imagery of the lion and the lamb. So the 4 living creatures, the 24 elders, bow down before the lamb, holding a harp and a golden bowl full of incense, or the prayers of the saints, singing a song saying, worthy are you to take the scroll and break its seals. So the similar substitution is actually found later too in Revelation chapter 8, verses 3-5. And another angel came and stood at the altar with a golden censer, and he was given much incense to offer with the prayers of all the saints on the golden altar before the throne. And the smoke of the incense with the prayers of the saints rose before God from the hand of the angel. Then the angel took the censer and filled it with fire from the altar and threw it on the earth. And there were pearls of thunder, rumblings, flashes of lightning, and an earthquake. In this passage, we see how powerful prayers can be and how close they are to the throne. It's almost as if the consequences that we see in chapter 5, which are devastating, and in chapter 8, are the consequences of those prayers that are delivered to the throne. This view that incense is like prayer is not new. It's not a new idea presented to us in Revelations or in the New Testament. We see the same idea as we read in Psalm 141 from David. What he means could be either two things. During the time where he was running away, he's asking God to replace the incense with prayer. Or two, instead of it being a full substitution, he can mean in addition to or comparative, use it as incense. Use my prayers as incense. Some of the functions of incense in general are that one, incense is ignited, so there has to be fire from within either a censer or the altar. And if you think about a censer, it's just, if you've seen it before, it's a little device that's on chains. So in case no one knows what a censer is, but it's used to spread incense. And of course, the altar being the altar where the incense will be burnt. Two, the function of incense is that due to its nature, because it's smoke, it burns, it goes up naturally. And it functions to honor God with its aroma. And three, as we already heard also, it must continue without end. In Exodus chapter 30, God tells Aaron that this must be done for all future generations, meaning it's perpetual, it's forever. We actually see this much, much later, closer to Jesus' birth, in Zechariah, where he had to go in the morning to burn the incense. So we see this tradition being passed on and followed throughout. And today being the last day of our series of learning how to pray. Having read the text, these various passages from the Bible, for this specific instance today, I want to create this connection between the prayer and incense. And as a resolution, I want to propose 3 if statements that will align with this function of incense. First, to quote David from Psalm, if our prayers to be counted as incense, they have to start from right here, from within. We often can hide things from other people. We can either hide things or feelings, but in front of God during prayer, this is the most intimate conversation we can have. We're completely exposed. This is the conversation where we can share our deepest secrets, our deepest sins, regrets. There is no point to hide anything from God. There's nothing that we can hide from God. It's not surprised that Jesus says in the Gospel of Matthew, if you're going to pray, go pray in private. Go close the room, pray in private. Prayer is not meant to be a show for other people so that we can avoid hypocrisy. Second, if our prayers are to be counted as incense, our each prayer will always be rising up to the one and only true God, always oriented up instead of ourselves. And the more we're able to practice this process, the more our hearts and minds can be transformed and reoriented to the right direction. Third, if our prayers to be counted as incense, we must practice this daily. And at least if we use the example of the Old Testament, this has to be done at least twice per day. But I'm sure we all agree that there is no really a limit to how many times we can practice this, how many times we can pray. In an ideal state, I think this is a perpetual state of mind, to always be in prayer. It is not surprising that even in the hardest moment in Gethsemane, Jesus asked his disciples to keep watch and pray. Besides being the second person of the Trinity, having both divine and human nature, Jesus is in unique position to fill this gap between prayer and incense. As we often hear in the Old Testament, things get fulfilled in the New Testament. For example, circumcision now becomes baptism, prayers become incense, And the animal sacrifice, which was required in the Old Testament, has now become living, everlasting sacrifice. There's this continual thread that runs throughout the entire Bible, the single story. In Exodus 30, we see that God commands Moses of how to prepare this incense. He gives him a list of very specific ingredients. Not only that, he says that this specific incense, it's not to be used for anything else. It's to be sacred. It's to be holy. Additionally, in the Old Testament, we also find out that only priests can offer this incense, as no one else in the tribe is qualified to do that. Coincidentally, but as we already know, nothing's really coincidence in the Bible, one of these sacred ingredients is brought to Jesus as a baby by the 3 wise men, frankincense. So one of those ingredients that was in the Old Testament has now connected to Jesus in the New Testament. Not only that, this thread expands because Jesus himself becomes the high priest, as we know from Hebrews. He becomes the priest, the high priest, who is worthy to offer the sacrifice and incense, and becoming this mediator forever for incense and sacrifice. To conclude, I would like to encourage everyone to take example from David and treat our prayers as incense that's going to be brought before God. I want to encourage that our prayers, just like functions of incense, come from within, are oriented up, and never ending. I wish to remind everyone of the living sacrifice, the high priest, Jesus Christ, who came for us so that we may live and continue to bring our prayers as incense in front of him. Amen.